Hey, howdy, howdy. We're going to move on to our second biodiversity lecture. So the reading that accompanies this is pages 380 through 390 from chapter 17. And we're going to talk a little bit about characteristics of endangered species. And what I mean by that is just like what types of qualities cause some species to be more prone to decline than others. Okay? We'll bring up what's called island biogeography theory. We'll do kind of a brief tutorial on that. We'll talk about human causes of biodiversity decline, and we'll talk about what it takes to be what's considered a biodiversity hotspot. All right. So endangered versus threatened species. So we've already established, right, that Earth's biological diversity has disappeared at an unprecedented rate. The type of rate that matches some of those past mass extinctions that you guys read about, okay, maybe even surpassing that rate. And so when we use the term endangered species, we're talking about species that faces threats that may cause it to become extinct within a short period. So if it's labeled as endangered, that means that without some sort of intervention, that species is likely to become extinct. Right? Some species are not quite to that point where we'd call them endangered, but they are what we call a threatened species. And a threatened species is just kind of a step before the endangerment label they get. It just means that their population's in decline, that they may be at risk of extinction. It's not imminent without intervention, but it's looking like it's trending toward that way. So oftentimes they try to intervene here at this threatened phase to avoid the kind of more catastrophic or urgent need, okay, to intervene. So we're going to talk about characteristics of endangered species, at least the types of characteristics that make some species more prone to decline than others. All right. And so we say an extremely small or localized range. That means they are endemic to a small area. Okay, and the word endemic, by the way, E-N-D-E-M-I-C, just simply means that it's only found there. It's native to a very specific type of habitat. Okay, so the types of species that kind of have a small localized range, they can only thrive in very specific habitats, are more prone to becoming endangered or extinct. All right. Requiring a very large territory to survive. So species, tigers are kind of a good example of this one. Okay, so to support a single tiger, a lot of habitat is needed because it's a really high predator, top predator. Okay, and that takes us back to those biological pyramids, right? So our top predators tend to have smaller numbers because they require an extremely large territory to survive. Okay, and the bigger that habitat that's needed, the smaller the general overall population, and the more likely it is for it to become endangered or extinct. Living on an island. What an island does, and we'll talk more about this in the island biogeography theory here shortly, is that it isolates a population. It doesn't allow for very easy immigration into a habitat, right? Nor does it allow them to leave a habitat if there's something going on, unlike terrestrial ecosystems. Low reproductive success. That just means that they don't tend to repopulate very quickly. Okay, so things like mice, for example, are going to have very little trouble repopulating because they have really, really high reproductive success. Some organisms, pandas are actually one of the examples. That's why we put so much time and energy into helping pandas. Are an example, though, they didn't have a lot of success with reproduction. Okay, or just a general small population size. In general, big populations are less prone to becoming endangered or extinct than small populations. That's pretty logical. So low reproductive rates, which is not the same as success, by the way. Rates is referring to our K-selected species. Right? So if you remember way back to chapter 4, we had our R-selected species, which have lots of offspring, hoping some of them survive. K-selected species have very few offspring, trying to make more of them survive, but if they generally don't have children very often and small broods, it makes them more likely to become endangered or extinct. All right, and then we also have some that they can survive in a lot of places, but they require very specialized breeding areas. So like the salmon, for example. Okay, salmon can survive pretty well, but because they have to return by instinct to their original spawning ground, that makes them makes the reproduction of salmon a little bit more problematic. Whereas if they just remained out in the saltwater and bred and reproduced out there, they probably wouldn't have any problems with declining numbers. Specialized feeding habits is another characteristic. So again, we could talk about pandas, which generally only thrive really well in bamboo forests. Okay. All right. So this is just kind of a list of particular qualities, whereas if a population exhibits one or more of these qualities, they are the ones that are more likely to become threatened or endangered over time. All right. So island biogeography theory is basically understanding the role islands play in maintaining biodiversity, I guess, or limiting biodiversity, would be a better way to put that. So islands being isolated, right? They tend to just generally be lower in biodiversity. All right. So small islands, for example, have less biodiversity than large islands, right? And that kind of makes sense, right? So for a species to migrate from the mainland to an island, the smaller that island is, the smaller the target, the less likely it is to end up there and populate. Okay? Islands close to the mainland, likewise, have more biodiversity than islands far away. And that's called the distance effect. All right, so if you've got a small island that is extremely far from the mainland, it's going to be very vulnerable to biodiversity loss, for one, but it's also just going to have less biodiversity in general. So places like Hawaii, for example, which does have a lot of very unique species, but it has, for example, there are no native mammals to Hawaii. It's just too isolated. Birds, plants, etc., insects populate Hawaii, but they just generally don't have any native mammals because it was such an isolated island, there was no way for mammals to migrate there. Okay? Now, humans came in, and humans brought with them mammals and other organisms, but it's such a small, isolated place out in the middle of the Pacific, small relative to our big continents and so on, that it just wasn't really possible for mammals to end up there. Mammals don't generally swim across giant bodies of water. Okay? So because of this, our larger islands that are closer to the mainland generally have lower extinction rates, right? More space allows for larger populations, more habitats, larger territories and stuff like that. And that's what island biogeography theory summarizes, right? Tells us that islands are particularly vulnerable to biodiversity loss, right? That smaller islands have less biodiversity, and islands farther away from the mainland have less biodiversity. And therefore, larger islands closer to the mainland tend to be less prone to biodiversity loss. Okay, so if we look at declining biodiversity, both in the U.S. and globally, we have some certain locations that we're going to call our biodiversity hotspots. All right, so in the U.S., Hawaii, for example, is most at risk. And again, what is Hawaii? It's a relatively small island, or several small islands, I should say, extremely far from the mainland. All right, so up to 63% of their native species are at risk. Okay, California, obviously not an island and not a small place, but part of the reason California has so many species at risk is that it's also the most populated state by humans, so lots and lots of habitat loss there. All right, if we go globally, our kind of two biggest areas of concern would be our tropical rainforests, right? So deforestation primarily for either subsistence agriculture or for ranching, okay, clearing area for rangelands, or more recently, but also much more scary, is the rapid loss of our coral reefs, right? So the bleaching from higher temperatures and most likely actually from the acidification of the oceans, right? From increased CO2 dissolving into the oceans. All right. So So to be considered a biodiversity hotspot, right? So these are places with really, really rapid biodiversity loss. So we have to have about 1,500 or more endemic plant species. So endemic, remember, is that term I brought up earlier. That would mean that the plant species that we're calling endemic are only found in that specific area. Okay? And 70% or more of its habitat must have already been lost to be qualified as a biodiversity hotspot. All right, so if you look globally at where our biodiversity hotspots are, you notice that there are a lot in our tropical areas, right? Okay, got some up here in California, etc. Okay, so moving on from the situations and qualifications or characteristics, I should say, of species that are more prone to becoming endangered or extinct are the initial causes, at least. And again, we're considering ourselves with human causes. Background extinction is a natural phenomenon. It's just part of the way life works. Species come and go. We are concerned with biodiversity loss that's a direct link to human activity. All right? And no big surprise, I think I brought this up, the number one cause biodiversity loss is destruction of habitats for whatever type of human development we may be talking. That could be clearing land for agriculture, clearing forest for rangelands for grazing cattle, for example, or converting over to crops. Okay, habitat loss, the number one cause of biodiversity loss. All right, number two would be invasive species, and we'll spend more time talking about those a little bit in class and kind of the special problem they pose. 3 would be pollution. 4 would be overharvesting or overhunting. Again, depending on what species we're talking about, sometimes that's the number one cause, as is the case with elephants and whales, right? And then, of course, climate change, particularly in our coral reef ecosystems. Okay? So habitat loss. So habitat loss or fragmentation, it actually, interesting, fits in really well with island biogeography theory. So we can take the lessons learned from island biogeography theory and apply it to our wilderness preserves or wildlife habitats, whatever you want to call them. Okay, if we've got these small, fragmented wildlife preserves, they tend to be less able to support populations and biodiversity than our larger, less isolated habitats. Okay? But yeah, habitat loss, fragmentation, the number one cause of species loss, right? Now, invasive species, what the special problem they pose is that, again, you have to consider an intact ecosystem, right? All of the organisms have, over generations, thousands of generations, basically learn to coexist within that ecosystem, right? So that the predator, the prey, the plants, the animals, the carbon cycles, all these things have constructed a functional ecosystem, right? When you introduce a species, a new species, into that ecosystem, now it might be the perfect habitat for that new species and allowing it to thrive, but that new species may end up out-competing others, right? Because they didn't evolve to compete with that organism. All right, and we'll look at some really important examples of that in class together. But, invasive species, and we got them all over the place. A lot of them are plants, by the way. Probably the biggest number of invasive species are actually plant species. But they come in and they occupy a niche and start out-competing the native species for whatever reason, and they kind of disrupt that ecosystem and the flow. And then there's that whole domino effect that can sometimes occur when an ecosystem is disrupted. Okay? Poaching and overharvesting is a problem for specific species. Tigers, overhunting and habitat loss was a big issue. Elephants, as we saw earlier, a huge portion of their species loss is due to hunting for their ivory, for example. Overhunting in the early 1900s, early 20th century for whales was a big problem in their decline. Okay. And then, of course, pollution in some cases, particularly our amphibian species, which we'll talk about here briefly. But things like acid rain and ozone depletion, climate change, ocean acidification, excessive fertilizers making their way into water, can really throw ecosystems for a loop. All right. And amphibians are what we call an indicator species. So when there is maybe a problem pollutant out in nature, okay, indicator species are the types of species that tend to be the first ones to show signs of habitat decline. Okay, so amphibians, for example, because they have really porous skin, so they actually absorb pollution a little more easily than other organisms. So if we're looking at a pond or aquatic ecosystem, we often notice that the frogs or other amphibian species, salamanders, for example, will be the first ones to show issues, right? And often, interestingly, deformities. So if you look carefully at the picture here, you see our frogs, our amphibian species here, sprouting some extra limbs, right? So the pollutions are causing some mutations in their cells, right? In the U.S., about 38% of amphibian species are currently declining. All right. And what's kind of scary about that is oftentimes when we can identify a specific cause, we can work to eliminate that one cause and help to mitigate the problem. We haven't really found a single cause of amphibian decline. So it could be a result of lots of different toxins. We're not really sure. Okay. That about wraps up what I want to talk about today. So make sure you guys do that 10 pages of reading. And when you walk in the door, next class period, we'll do a quick entry task kind of covering this, but then we'll delve into some specific invasive species and talk about the problems that they pose. All right?